25 years ago, I made a series of films about wine that saw me travel the world, building up into a history, which then became a book. Today, I thought I'd revisit it and cut it up into bite-sized chunks for you to view exclusively online. I hope you enjoy viewing them as much as I enjoyed making them. Everyone's heard of pasteurization and its inventor, Louis Pasteur. But where's the connection with wine? Well, I went to the Jura, to Pasteur's birthplace, to find out.
In the middle of the last century, France was enjoying a wine boom. Her reputation had never been so high, but there were problems ahead that threatened to ruin her most celebrated industry, even to kill it off altogether. Problems that could only be solved by newfound scientific knowledge. The first to cause national dismay was that French wine of all qualities was frequently turning to vinegar before it reached the table. It was even turning to vinegar in the producers' cellars. France had been making wine for over 2,000 years, and yet still nothing was known about its real chemistry. What was fermentation? Why did some wines keep while others went off? The wine trade could never fulfill its huge potential until someone found out. The emperor turned to France's most famous scientist, Louis Pasteur. Pasteur was brought up in the little town of Arbois in eastern France. When the emperor appealed to him, he left his professorship in Paris and went back to his childhood home to work with the wines he knew best. Today, his house has become a national shrine for the whole of France. This is the laboratory that he eventually set up, still full of his equipment and his drawings. In fact, it's really the room in which one can say that wine science was born. Pasteur discovered the fundamental fact that yeasts are what cause grape juice to ferment. And most crucially, he established the connection between the preservation of wine and the oxygen in the atmosphere. The microscope was his essential tool. Pasteur discovered that wine is full of microscopic forms of life, microbes and bacteria. And if they're allowed to grow, they'll eventually destroy the wine. They'll turn it into vinegar. But to grow, they need air. And if you can keep the air out completely, the wine will keep indefinitely. If this is impossible, he found, you can kill the microbes by heating the wine in its bottle. And this is the process that took his name. It's called pasteurization.
For a while, phylloxera was a mystery. France's livelihood in its vineyards was dying before its eyes. What could be doing it?
In most of southern France, the whole economy depended on wine. As their vines died, villages were abandoned. Lives were disrupted, not just in France, but soon throughout the whole of Europe. The government offered prizes for remedies, for suggestions of all kinds, for anything that would bring hope to a country whose national identity almost was in mortal peril. There were plenty of theories, but it certainly didn't occur to anyone that the speed of the newly invented steamships across the Atlantic had anything to do with the problem. It allowed this horrible creature, a native of America, to survive the Atlantic crossing and reach Europe alive. This is a phylloxera beetle, in real life no bigger than a pinprick. How could something so microscopic cause such havoc? How could this feeble-looking, green fly-like insect be wiping out the vineyards of Europe?
These mystery bugs, what the scientists called phylloxera the devastator, were killing every vine they touched. So what on earth could be done about it?
The scientist turned detective to find the culprit was Emile Plancha. It was he who hit on the vital clue. His hunch was that an unknown insect that he was studying might be at the root of the problem. He actually named this insect, and he called it Phylloxera vastatrix, which means the devastator. What he did was to follow this insect back to its origins in America and talk to experts there about it. Well, this was the moment of breakthrough, because in Ohio he found that some of the American vines were living perfectly happily with this parasite. Here in the library, back in Montpellier in France, they keep the dried specimens of every sort of American vine that was brought back here for investigation. If the roots of the American vines were resistant to the parasite, then surely the answer must be to graft the European vines on top. And this is exactly what they did. Eventually, it had to be done everywhere in Europe and throughout the rest of the world as well. This plant is a young American vine. First, its top is cut off, leaving only the roots and a stump. Then the stump is split with a knife. Next, a cutting of whatever European vine has been chosen is sharpened and inserted into the V-shaped split. Finally, the whole thing is bound tight with raffia and covered over with soil. Well, that's fine when there are just a few vines to graft in a field, but obviously there has to be an industrial method when there are thousands to do. So nowadays we use a machine which cuts a notch. You take a piece of American wood which is going to have the roots, and you put it in this machine which cuts a very neat notch in it. Then you take the top of the plant, which is the French wood, and you put it in the same machine which ingeniously unites the two with a perfect join like that.
It's sometimes hard to believe how rapidly we've come, technologically speaking, from the Middle Ages to modern times. I remember so well how primitive winemaking in Spain used to be, even in my lifetime.
Above all, what revolutionized Rioja was the introduction of the Bordeaux barrel. In those days, most of Spain's wine was stored and transported in animal skins. Wine aged in wood came as a revelation. Oak is very strongly flavored. Just think of the pungency of a carpenter's shop. Well, that flavor came to mean quality in the Spanish mind, and they could scarcely get too much of it. They used to keep the wine, whether it was red or white, in these Bordelaises for 8, 10, even up to 20 years. The sweet smell of these waterfalls of wine is irresistible. This cellar technology, the so-called racking of maturing wine from one barrel to another, clears it of sediment and lets it briefly breathe. It was copied from the cellars of Bordeaux in the 1860s. Was the wine like Bordeaux? This time capsule of a tasting room, with its vintage cobwebs far below ground, is the place to find out. The answer is yes and no. This is a 1920 Red Rioja that I'm tasting. It's beautifully sweet and delicate. I can detect the clean taste of fruit, the lightness of texture that Rioja learned from France. But what's different is the less assertive flavor of Rioja's grapes, and above all, the smell and taste of oak. The wood is like the cream on the strawberries, as it were. I love it. To me, these immensely fragrant, immensely long-lived wines have as much right to be called great classics as anything from France.